The march to the midterms is on, and this morning, a new race to keep a close eye on. Bob Corker's sought-after Senate seat in the state of Tennessee. Last night, Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn easily won the Republican nomination, while President Trump endorsed and even campaigned alongside of her. Now Blackburn will face Democrat Phil Bredesen, the state's former governor, who is in what is likely to become a remarkably competitive race. And in this race for governor, Republicans nominated a political outsider and a very wealthy businessman, Bill Lee. He notably defeated Congresswoman Diane Black, who closely aligned herself with President Trump, but failed to secure his endorsement. The president did not endorse any candidate in that race. And my panel is back with me. All right, Eddie, Axios said that last night proved President Trump's endorsement is worth its weight in gold in 2018.
I think they're absolutely right. And that's why so many Republicans are so scared. They lack courage. But the question is, will his endorsement prove to be valuable in the general election? So we know what happens in primaries. We know what happens in Republican primaries, and we've known this for a while. The candidates bank right, and they play to the base. Donald Trump is powerful there. What happens in the general primary, particularly when Democrats are excited?
Then let's talk about banking left. In the race for Bob Corker's seat, the Washington Post says the Democratic nominee, Phil Bredesen, who I just mentioned, gives his party its best chance of statewide general election victory in more than a decade. He has presented himself as an affable centrist willing to work with President Trump, and his presence on the ballot forces the GOP to play defense on its home turf. That sounds to me like a really smart strategy. Yet what is happening inside the Democratic Party while we're in primary season is the rise of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez campaigning with Bernie Sanders. And if you turn on Fox News, every day they're talking about the rise of democratic socialism, and that gets people scared. So while Republicans make a mistake banking to the right, do Democrats make the same mistake banking to the left?
Well, let's think about this in the context of Tennessee. It makes sense for this candidate to be centrist in Tennessee. It made sense for Ocasio-Cortez to be who she was in her particular district.
Great point.
And Lamar Alexander in Tennessee. You had Harold Ford and his family in Tennessee. All centrist Democrats, centrist Republicans over the course of the last 30 years.
And you think we've long forgotten about Conor Lamb. In his district. But when you look at what he actually believed, what the policies, the positions he actually took, right, he doesn't seem like he would be the person to join the Blue Dog Caucus, though, right, which is always an issue in terms of what Democrats can do, the ways in which these ideological differences play themselves out in actual policy decisions.
I also think we sit here and we talk about this big concept of socialism. We debate what it actually means. All the polling that I've seen, when people go out state by state and ask what people care about, it's about the cost of health care.
Yes.
Right? That's what people care about.
Yes.
So if you can show up and you can say, I'm going to take care of the cost of health care, like that's a really powerful argument.
But you're getting into details and you're talking about a nuanced, powerful argument. But lots of people don't get into the argument. They just go, oh my gosh, socialist, I can't have that. It's going to take all my money.
And I will tell you, if the entire Democratic Party gets branded as socialist successfully going into the midterms or into the 2020 presidential, depending on who takes that mantle, they lose.
Even if those are winning policies, it's such a difficult term.
This is the thing. We can reject the label and just simply, there's an old philosophical concept. Let's explicate by elimination. Let's get rid of the term and see what it stands for. When we talk about decent wages, we talk about being able to afford one's house, when we talk about being able to send one's kid to an affordable college, when we talk about the basic on-the-ground issues, and we saw this in Virginia.
Then, Eddie, then the answer is take a page from the Republicans' playbook. They've hijacked the word patriot. The word patriot is a beautiful, strong American word. It means one who defends the honor and values of their country in the face of foes. The president does the opposite in the eyes of Helsinki.
I think they are taking a page from the Republicans' playbook, but it's a page from the 80s. They are staking out a position way out on the fringe to drag the party in their direction. And if you want to drag the party in your direction, that is what you have to do. It takes decades.
Oh, I thought you were going to say they're wearing neon and doing
think about what
I'm sorry.
Think about what we're calling fringe. Think about what we're calling the far left.
I'm with you.
What this suggests is how fundamentally, constricted the spectrum of American politics has become.
You're completely right.
According to today's standards, Walter Mondale would be a freaking far left socialist.
Well, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is basically Angela Merkel, right? She's
Yes,
in
well,
Europe,
great
she'd
point.
be a center-right.
I mean,
Good
Jeez.
luck selling that in the United States. Listen,
Yeah.
Richard Nixon would be a Democrat today almost. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, so yes, the politics have changed, but I do think the labeling and messaging is going to make an enormous difference. If the Democrats get branded as democratic socialists, it does not sell in the
But let me
United
just say this
States.
really
You
quick.
do have to break it down to
Take the time,
policy.
Eddie.
Really quickly, what I do know in this political climate is that Republican light will no longer work.
Yes.
Correct.
So
What does that mean?
Republican light, that is, I'm an Eisenhower Republican.
Well, Christy Todd Whitman said that the other night.
yeah.
You know, Bill Clinton,
Mm-hmm.
triangulating, taking the Republican
It doesn't.
issues and make them yours. The Democratic Leadership Council of 1985 will not work in 2018.
That's true.
Clintonism is dead.
Yep.
And the question is, what will take its place? And we notice in Obama's 81 endorsements, he did not endorse
But-
Ocasio-Cortez. Why? Because this is the battle that's happening
This
in
is
the
interesting
party.
to
But
me.
you know who could win this argument, I think, is Howard Schultz, because he is the embodiment of everything that you're talking about: corporate responsibility, health care available to people in a way that a businessman can present it as a good proposition,
Okay.
as opposed to a political philosophy.
Howard Schultz or someone whose name rhymes with Schmeich Schmoomberg.
Well, yes, Schmeich would be fabulous because he has talked about all those things, and he's also worth $20 billion or $30 billion, and he could sell it in a way that others can't.
I wish we could figure out what it is that we could call socialism, because my frustration is, what do you want to call what they have in Germany, where they've got a bigger social state, you don't fall through the cracks, and yet somehow they've managed to not fail as a state. Whatever you want to call that.
Manufacturing powerhouses in the world.
Whatever you want to call Denmark, we can name a bunch of different countries that have that. Whatever you want to call that, can we have that?
I'm telling you, I think
it's
you
not
should steal
radical.
a big, beautiful American word like patriotism because everybody likes it. But what the president is actually putting forth is the opposite of it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.